Welcome to Lunch with Tech Leaders, where we have engaging conversations about software development and cloud engineering with industry leaders and subject matter experts. These episodes are created by the Great Lakes Tech Leaders, an online community of technology practitioners. Please come join the conversation by visiting gltl.rbn.ai. Again, that's gltl.rbn.ai. Now strap in, because we're deploying to production in 3, 2, 1.
All right. Welcome to the latest episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. My name is Jason Brown. I'm a cloud solutions architect with Right Brain Networks, and I'm your host for today. Joining me is software and data consultant Tom Kowalski.
Hello.
And also joining us is subject matter expert and recurring guest on the podcast, Preston Fraser, senior software engineer from the Interoperability Institute. Welcome back, Preston.
Thanks, Jason. Happy to be here.
All right. So in this episode, we're going to discuss building an API in a serverless context. So we've got a lot to discuss, and let's get going. I'm going to do something a little bit different than normal today. So I'd like to present both of you with the same scenario and just kind of discuss working through the problem. So let's say we're tasked to build a brand new API, a REST API using only serverless components. And we're also given the requirement that it has to run in AWS. So I'd like to walk through some of the decision-making processes that each of you would normally make when building an API from scratch. Hopefully we can gain some insight as to how each of you chooses, a service feature or tool for each component of the hypothetical application. So yeah, let's get started. So I'll kick it off with you, Tom. So first of all, how do you usually begin? What tools are you using to get things started completely fresh?
So it really depends on the team. So, or, if I'm doing this myself, right, I like to try different things and learn different things. That's completely different. But if at my previous organization, I would help different teams that were making a new API and using serverless technologies. It was kind of our go-to for new things. Depending on what we picked, either the language or, the tools, it really depends on where the team is. And, are they willing to learn more? Can they, the time to do that? That is the biggest factor for me. So are they familiar with Dynamo? Are they, more comfortable with, does it have to be a REST API? Or GraphQL was another one. So we would either leverage AppSync or API Gateway. That is the biggest factor for me, depending on where the team is, how much time they have, even more than the workload itself and what it requires. So that's my thought on that at a high level.
Awesome. Yeah. Preston, do you have any thoughts about any other considerations that you have when choosing the tools to get things off the ground?
Sure. Yeah. I really like what Tom said about, what his considerations are, because definitely, you need your resources, your engineers to be comfortable with, services, because some of them do have a really big learning curve, and you need to make sure, based on the time you have, if you don't have enough time to learn how these services work, you need to pick something that's you're going to be a little bit comfortable with, at least. Certainly in my experiences, you always learn a lot as you go anyways. But, we've in the company, we've built a lot of serverless APIs, and we've really gotten down a methodology that we like. But that's not necessarily to say that we don't, consider another option if we see a service that might really be useful for a certain use case. But a lot of times we like to start out with, an architecture diagram. We use an application called draw.io, which really lets you put, blocks on the screen and kind of move things around and really lay out that architecture and visual sense of, serverless pieces are going to fit together, what blocks are going to go together. So we got API Gateway, backed by Lambda or Dynamo tables. So getting that architecture diagram out there first, I think really can visually let you see maybe what you want to do or the pieces that you have to work with. And we all know there's a lot of serverless and AWS services in general that can be used. So putting those all out and kind of having discussions about what pieces would fit together at first, that's where we like to start.
Yeah, I'd just like to add on to that too. We would have, a bunch of other projects as well that, we've built on and, kind of evolved. So really the technology choice is what was the last one built. It's really a clone of that. And then it's like, okay, what do we make, what do we switch in and out of here and there? But that's usually, even when I'm doing something for myself, it's nice to start off with a clone, either like an open source repo of something, getting started template or something like that. Kind of shapes the technology choices. But yeah, that's when talking about what technologies, services to leverage. This is if we've already decided if it needs to be its own API and what the boundary is, the bounded context and domain and everything. But yeah, just wanted to throw that out there.
Exactly. Just to, add on to that, I think, if you're working at a company where you repeatedly build a lot of these projects, it's maybe good to have a template project that you keep up to date. So like Tom said, you can, clone that. If you're not taking it from, a third party place internally, you can have a template repository where you just, clone that, and then you turn that into your current project. If you build a lot of the same type of projects, very common ones are like we're talking about REST API, with some kind of service behind it. Very common workflow. So having a template project is a great place to start.
Excellent. All right. So yeah, let's just say for this scenario, we don't have any templates on hand, but we are retrieving one and making it our own, like a third party one. And though the team is fairly well versed in a variety of languages, they decide to standardize on Python because that's the one that everybody has the most experience with. So when building out like the architecture and deciding on like a compute layer, so would you instinctively go for Lambda or ECS Fargate? What are the considerations to choose between the two, or perhaps something totally different? Yeah, like we'll start with you, Preston.
Sure. Upfront thinking about starting with an API gateway, it's a great entry point. If you have a public API, it's a great entry point from outside connections on the internet into your private cloud or your ecosystem there. One of the big things to consider is we were talking about, we started talking about REST API. There's additional, you can do WebSocket with API gateway, but let's maybe focus on a REST API. You gotta see what the remember what the limitations are of the service. A big one is a hard timeout on REST API connections. 30 seconds currently is what they give. So that means that every request that comes to that API gateway, it's only going to be able to live for 30 seconds before that REST API closes. For those kind of small requests, we're probably going to look at Lambda instead of ECS, unless there's like a ECS task that's always running. You maybe have a cluster of tasks that are always up. That's an option if you kind of have that already established. A lot of times we really first look at using Lambda because of the quick startup time. Having a Lambda immediately start up when you get that request to the API gateway is a great thing we look at. Again, ECS can be used, but usually not behind an API gateway unless we already have a cluster stood up and running. That's usually our rule of thumb.
Yeah, my take on it, again, right, depends on the team, what they're familiar with, but you want to use the highest abstraction that you can. So, if we're deciding that this is an API, does it need to have a lot of logic in it, right? Are most of the calls just, being read? Does it even need Lambda, right? Can you just use like a VTL, right, to Dynamo or something? So yeah, just picking that highest abstraction that you can would be my recommendation to go to after, what is the team more comfortable with?
Okay. So let's say in this hypothetical scenario, we've determined that all of the requests are going to be pretty quickly responded to, and there's no long-running tasks as of yet. So we've decided on Lambda. I know that, if I'm building a REST API and I'm doing this either, in a traditional way or even on ECS, I'm going to be using like a web framework of some kind. If we're using Python, something like Flask, if I want it to be really lightweight. If I want something with, a larger feature set, I might use something like Django or something else. So I really wanted to hear both your takes on this. If you're doing this in Lambda, is it worth it to use a web framework? And yeah, I'd just like to kick off that discussion.
I mean, again, it depends on how much skill you have, but, something like that doesn't take a long time to get set up and configured, especially with the help of something like Serverless framework, where there's a few plugins that make the integration between the API gateway payload and what Flask needs really easy. When you're looking at the size of a project, there's considerations. Are you doing one API path, or are you going to have multiple paths and maybe it'll grow bigger? One API path, that's, very doable without, web framework. But as you get more, paths on your API gateway, as the application grows, the web framework's really going to help you out to keep your application structured and to make it easy to look at the code, add on code. And, it gives you a lot of features to the web framework. The things that come with things like Flask or Django, you're going to be able to use those things to be broken out into, request body, parameters, global variables. It's going to be a little bit more rich of an application when you can add that framework on. And honestly, if it's more than one, our rule of thumb is if it's more than one, API path that goes to your Lambda, we are going to probably put the web framework on there. And we do use Flask.
Yeah, I completely agree with those. Depends on the team, what they're familiar with, how big it's going to be, and how much it's going to change. There's a lot of it depends factors in there.
I just one other tip too. I've seen implementations where there's a different Lambda function for each API path on an API gateway. And, that just seems to get a little extraneous, a little too many Lambdas that it's not necessary. You can put a lot of code into one Lambda function and, it not a problem. It really keeps your architecture compact. You can do that.
Yeah. On that note, I agree with that. Some people are like purist or whatever. It has to, every little thing has to, at least privilege on each function. And I think it really comes down to, there shouldn't be so much of a permission, issue, because it should be within that one context and should have access to its data. I think it really comes down to the different workloads. And if you want to use different settings, right? If you're using Lambda and maybe this one call just performs a lot better with a lot more memory. So you want to have it on a separate Lambda, or it's doing something that has a lot bigger payload, or the size of the function's a lot bigger, right? You're doing like web scraping, and you have a big old library or layer or whatever to do that. That might make sense to put in a separate one, so the call starts a little faster or whatever. But yeah, again, I don't think it's a big deal. And yeah, if you can just get away with one Lambda function, go for it.
And like you said, maybe you want to have a separate Lambda function that is, kind of sectioned off with its own permissions. And that's not to say your Lambda can't directly invoke another Lambda function. You can certainly do that. Again, we're talking about 30 seconds here with the REST API. A lot of times we want a fast response with a REST API. We really don't want to wait 30 seconds, especially for like most client user interface applications. Maybe system to system, that's probably fine for it to be longer. But you can invoke other Lambdas from other Lambdas, so it's possible to kind of chain things together.
It does depend, right, on what infrastructure as code you're using. A lot of them make it easy to, switch to all their own Lambda functions or just one with just a line of code or configuration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny because I've seen APIs, sliced up in a bunch of different ways in the manner that you guys are describing. Like, if you have a REST resource like /users, you could do a get, put, post, all on that REST resource. I've seen people divide things up to where, you have one Lambda per resource that can handle all of the CRUD operations. Or, like we said before, you could split it out to have one per CRUD operation, but that can get pretty unwieldy. There's definitely a lot more moving parts and a lot more things to manage, but it just depends on the requirements.
Yeah. One more factor I'd like to add to that was monitoring. That kind of made a decision for us too, and what tool you're using. Some of the monitoring tools, it just makes it a lot cleaner if it is all separated. Some of them do a good job of separating out if it's, a different path coming in, and they can, show those all separated out coming in, even though it's the same Lambda function. So that was one consideration that we had of breaking them all up. It just made the monitoring a lot easier for certain tools.
Excellent. Awesome. So so I guess again, for this scenario, let's assume we've chosen API gateway, and we want to implement auth for the API. And we want to use the API gateway authorizer to do so. So would you integrate with Cognito or use a custom authorizer? And what are the considerations between using one versus the other?
Yeah, I'm glad we were talking about authorization because we just finished talking about, permissions for a Lambda function. If you're using API gateway, you can, first thought is to use Cognito because it natively integrates with API gateway and it allows you to do several different OAuth flows or API authentication. There is API key is another form of authentication that API gateway offers, but we usually look towards using, token-based authentication like with Cognito. So, if you're using let's say a client credentials grant flow, which is a common system-to-system OAuth flow where the client exchanges a client ID and a client secret for a token and provides that token to your API. If you're going that route, it really makes it easy to specify different scopes per request path, because then you can break up those, apply scopes for read APIs or write APIs or whatever kind of permissions you want to break up. Client credentials flow with scopes really lets you, it's really a good choice for setting those permissions. Now, that's not the only flow that you can do. You can certainly do like an authorization code flow where you have like a UI application and an end user is logging in and they provide a different type of token to the API. It's still an OAuth token, but it's one that doesn't have scopes on it. That flow is a little more challenging to work with because you can't specifically set the permissions at the API gateway layer. You need something a little more custom after the API gateway to determine what permissions that user has. With that authorization grant flow, Incognito usually it's going to be what they call an ID token, which contains claims and specific, user attributes for that particular user. And with that, you need to interpret those after the API gateway, which could be a custom authorizer, or you could do that in your actual Lambda code. So, I think that's the consideration right there. What OAuth flow will you be using if you're using OAuth? What auth flow are you using? Are you using client credentials where you can just set the scopes on the API gateway? Or do you have a authorization code flow of OAuth where those user permissions are actually inside of your ID token that is being sent in and needs some more authorization than the API gateway can provide? That's kind of the consideration I see. A lot of times for doing the ID flow, it's not actually a custom authorizer, so to say, but it's just part of our Lambda function that the API gateway calls. The API gateway still validates that the token's valid, but our application code actually looks at the token and determine what permissions user has and applies those to our specific application logic. So yes, depending on the situation.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there, right? It depends on what your company is already using, right? What is going to be calling this? Is it just backend services, or I guess is it going to be called from front end applications, and how's auth already being done in your organization? And then there's another factor too. If it's multi-region, it can make things a lot more complicated. So just factoring that in there. I don't want to get into all the details, but especially using Cognito or anything else, right? If it's multi-region, you really have to think out that strategy of why you're multi-region, and is it just for redundancy or data localization? And there's a lot of factors.
Yeah, and I mean, general rule of thumb to start off with too. I keep saying rule of thumb, but like in my opinion, you're always going to want to have some kind of auth on your API gateway. Just at first thought. One thing we didn't mention, but it should be a given for using serverless components, is everything costs money, and things cost money usually with the amount that they're used or the length of time that they're running for. And so, with API gateway, the cost is like proportional to the amount of requests that go through it. And you really wouldn't want to run into a scenario where you have an attacker sending many requests to your API and just racking up those costs. You'd want those requests either denied, or you'd want some kind of block to prevent those from coming in. The costs rack up, I think, for authenticated requests. I think when things are blocked, they don't charge you for those. So there's a couple strategies. One's obviously having authentication on there to make sure users are authorized. Another thing to do is a web application firewall, a WAF, which can filter out traffic, which kind of offers another, not layer of authentication, but a firewall that you can configure maybe to restrict certain IPs or something. WAF is a consideration on top of having some kind of authentication on your API. Good security consideration to protect your API, but also prevent unwanted costs.
Yeah, that's a good one. It reminds me, because we were burned on costs with Cognito, because it is like monthly active users, and we had some fancy testing. It was all ephemeral accounts that were created, so it would make a new account for every single test run that it did. So it was making hundreds of thousands, could have made millions of accounts a month. So the dev costs were going to be astronomical. So we had to kind of tailor the solution around that. So costs are a consideration.
All right, excellent. I know we're getting close to time here, but I want to squeeze in one more question before we wrap up. We talked a lot about API gateway. I know another alternative for the application level gateway in AWS is AppSync. So in your opinion, what situations would AppSync be worth using instead of API gateway?
Good question. I have used AppSync before, but we migrated away from it for a few reasons. Specifically because API gateway gave us more flexibility overall. AppSync is interesting. It's a great way to map requests to specific AWS services, which API gateway can do the same thing as well. But I think AppSync might be, I don't want to say it's like easier to use, but I think it's a little more structured in, there's not so much customizability with it. It's kind of, you define the schema for, say, a Lambda invoke or a Dynamo insert. You design the, schema that gets inserted into Dynamo, or maybe you're sending something to like a Kinesis Firehose. But all these things I think are very rigidly structured. And there is authentication that can be obviously put on AppSync, just like API gateways. but I think there's a lot more. It's a lot more defined, and it's harder to scale. It's harder to scale, whereas API Gateway scales a lot better when you have more request paths that need to be done. I think it kind of takes AppSync can kind of help take that compute layer out sometimes. So specifically when you're maybe want a request that just goes to and stores a record in Dynamo, or it sends a record to Firehose, or one of those services. It kind of allows you to maybe get past the need for a Lambda if you don't need that. But I find that you may quickly run into a scalability issue where you needed to do a lot more than it's currently doing. That's where I see the limits of AppSync are. And I'd almost always go with API Gateway unless you have a really small application that does something very specific, and your API is going to do something very specific and nothing more.
Yeah, I would just like to say I've went both ways with different teams, and it depends on the team and what they want to do, and the considerations of how they integrate with other services and what they're going to be doing. There's a lot of factors, right? And then the multi-region was a lot trickier to do the multi-region with AppSync. But I think a lot of that has changed since I did that.
It's possible.
So.
And the costs might be different too. Maybe AppSync is cheaper than API Gateway. There could be that too.
A lot of factors.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that pretty much we pretty much hit time for today. We talked a lot about the compute layer. We didn't really get into the data layer very much, although we did kind of briefly touch on Dynamo. And we didn't get into any other kind of components like asynchronous components. So I'm hoping we could do that on a future episode. But for today, I guess we'll go ahead and conclude. So I want to take the opportunity to thank all of our listeners for tuning into today's episode of Lunch with Tech Leaders. We hope you found the conversation informative and valuable. We'd love to have you join us again for next week's episode, Incident Response at GitHub. As always, the episode will feature expert guests and interactive conversations, so be sure to tune in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.